over those who remain. And it's always this image that once judgment descends on Judah, Jerusalem, Israel, the nations, the world, most people are just destroyed and perish. But there's always a few people who literally remain, who are left over. And on the one hand, the remnant is always, in one sense, a negative theme. It bears testimony that Israel has overwhelmingly not been faithful, and most of them experience judgment. But it's also always, at the same time, a hopeful theme. Because the fact that some are still left, some still remain, reminds Israel God hasn't given up on us, and the future of Israel is always carried forward on the shoulders of this group. And the shoulders of this group leads to, in Isaiah and in the Old Testament in general, the northern and the southern kingdom coming back together at some point. When these guys are faithful, there'll be a reunion, and then the nations will stream in, and then finally there will be a new heavens and a new earth. Here's something I want you to notice the next time you read the book of Acts. The book of Acts, and I'll bet you all know it even if you don't quite know what I'm talking about first, almost everyone agrees that Acts 1:8 is the thesis statement of the book of Acts. There's this small remnant of 12 disciples and maybe a few dozen more at the beginning of the book of Acts. And Jesus tells them, until you're clothed with power from on high by the Spirit, I want you to stay where? I want you to stay in Jerusalem. And if you read the book of Acts, you'll notice that chapters 1 through 7 take place in Jerusalem. But then once you are clothed with power from on high, you will be my witnesses, which we're going to see this summer, comes from Isaiah. The language of being a witness is an Isaianic phrase. Then you will be my witnesses where? Judea, or Judah, and Samaria, and finally where? The ends of the earth. This absolutely tells a story that's familiar to the Old Testament. First, a remnant needs to be reclaimed, which is what Jesus did during his life and his death and his resurrection. And then it's time to regather the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. And chapters 8 through 12 take place here. And then chapter 13, and this is where the Apostle Paul begins being the main character, to 28 take place in Thessalonica, in Corinth, in Galatia, in Rome, the Gentiles. The book of Acts basically streamlines church history through the lenses of how Isaiah looks at the future. There will be a remnant that is finally faithful, the Spirit's poured out. And then they will regather the Jewish people. All the evangelism happens among the Jews in these chapters, and then the nations will participate in the redemption that Israel has experienced. The book of Acts tells the story of the church through the framework that Isaiah gives us for the future. So yeah, whether it's the 12 tribes in Revelation, whether it's here in Acts, the New Testament is often trafficking in these categories and this language and this framework, and we often miss it. Okay, other thoughts, other questions? Corinne.
The different types of judgment in the first Isaiah, is that referring to like the judgment that Jesus received, the judgment that's coming when Jesus comes back?
Great question.
Is it something that happened historically? Or
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a question that ultimately is about what prophecy, how prophecy works as a genre. For now, I would insist strongly on this. You need a good reason when you're reading Isaiah or any prophetic book of the Old Testament to hear it as anything else other than judgment on 8th century Judah, judgment on 6th century Babylon, judgment on the world in Isaiah's day. This is always first and foremost about judgments that actually happened then. If there's any application for things that happen later in and through Jesus or the church, it's because the prophecy gets reapplied, not because the prophecy was looking down the corridors of the time and saying, one day Jesus is going to come and die on the cross for the sins of the world. There might be a few ultimate direct predictions like that in Isaiah, but by and large, prophecy speaks to the people of God in their day, in their historical circumstances. It isn't, so to speak, ignoring Ahaz, ignoring Hezekiah. They're like, Grant, this is actually about you. Right? That's not how prophetic books work, but it's often how evangelical Christians read prophetic books. Like, it's so cool that Isaiah is just speaking right about me. write directly about me. It's like, no, it's not. It does ultimately speak to me, but only because it first spoke to their situations. So unless you have a really good reason to suspect otherwise, and we'll talk about specific instances along the way this summer, we should always read it as being addressed to the historical location and context that it's grounded in, and not skipping that to talk about us much later on in history. Good. All right, well, let's talk about historical background for a couple of minutes. We've already covered a lot of this. When we talk about the exile, pre-exile, exile, post-exile, there's actually two exiles in Israel's history. The first one takes place in 701 BC. If there are a couple of dates that you want to know about the Old Testament, one of them is 701 BC. In this year, Assyria, of which Nineveh is the capital, came and destroyed Samaria and carried the 10 tribes into exile in Assyria. Some of you are probably aware that to this day, whether it's the modern nation of Israel or really just throughout the diaspora, which literally just means dispersion over the last few millennia, there has been a long-standing debate within Judaism of who exactly counts as a Jew. Right? And some of you know that in modern Israel, basically the most standard definition is that if your mom's Jewish, you're Jewish. Your dad might not be Jewish, his dad might not be Jewish, but if your mom is Jewish, you're Jewish. One of the reasons Jewish identity ethnically has become so complicated in history is that the 10 tribes never came back. The 10 tribes were basically lost to history. And so whether it's in Second Temple Judaism, books that, like I know you know some of these, in Catholic canonical kind of literature, things like Maccabees and Tobit and Judith are often included. Those are often mysterious books to Protestants. But these books that are written after the close of the Old Testament period, but before Jesus comes, or whether it's in the New Testament itself, there's often language about the 12 tribes, like Revelation, are going to come back together, and almost certainly that language is often just loaded with symbolism, because the 10 tribes are gone. They're just lost to history at this point. Some of them come back, but by and large, either these tribes are just decimated, or people no longer know which ones they come from in the future. And so in 701 BC, the northern kingdom loses to Assyria, and they're taken off into exile, and that exile never ends. And that's the first one, and that is often understood, if not always understood, as happening because of the northern kingdom's unfaithfulness. The next date you need to know is 587 BC. If you have ever read the book of Daniel, he is never named in Isaiah, which is somewhat strange, but the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, finally knocks down the front doors of Jerusalem in 587 BC after laying siege to it for 3 years and starving the city to death. And if you want to read some horrific descriptions historically, which everyone agrees are true, read the stories in Kings, but especially Lamentations. Lamentations is about this. Lamentations is not about suffering in general. Lamentations is about how awful this was for Israel. And you will read language about, not to be too gross, but it happened in history and it's there in the Bible, about people having to drink their own urine to not thirst to death. People having to eat their own feces not to starve to death. Women having to eat their own infants in order to survive. When Isaiah says in 2nd Isaiah, Israel, Zion, you think I can forget you? I can no more forget you than a human mother forgets her young, but even if they forget, I won't forget you. That's a reminder that sometimes this got to be such a desperate situation that even human mothers ended up having to abandon their own children because of how desperate this was. And after 3 years, they finally get through the gates. Judah, Jerusalem, is burned to the ground. The temple is destroyed. And the vast majority of those two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, are carried off into Babylon for exile for the next 70 years. This is what the book of Daniel is about. Jeremiah predicts it and then begins talking about it. All of Ezekiel takes place there. And this is, whenever you read the Psalms and you hear, we sat down by the rivers of Babylon and wept. Right? This makes something like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor in America's history look like kids' play. This was like the ultimate catastrophe in Israel's history. We'll talk a lot about Zion throughout this summer, but Zion was understood before this happened as the one place on earth that nobody could touch. The one place in the world where things were actually the way they were supposed to be, where God dwelt, and therefore we were safe and secure. And Israel's, this is maybe a bit exaggerative, but not much. What Israel experienced theologically in this moment of history would be somewhat similar to what we would experience theologically if National Geographic reported tomorrow that somebody dug up the bones of Jesus. Right? It's like the resurrection happened, Zion can never be violated. And all of a sudden, Zion is violated, and the city that is the joy of all the earth and the most secure place where Israel can never be touched falls, and they are given into the hands of their enemies. This is the ultimate catastrophe in Israel's history, and Isaiah is all about responding to it and interpreting what exactly it means, both in the present and in the future. 539 BC is when, this is the end of 2nd Chronicles, this is Ezra and Nehemiah, this is a couple of times in Isaiah 40 to 55. If you remember the name Cyrus, king of Persia, the reason he is significant in the Old Testament is Persia is the next great empire, and just as Babylon took out Assyria, Persia, 70 years later, takes out Babylon, and Cyrus, king of Persia, enacts an edict that says the exiles can go home. You can go home, you can rebuild Jerusalem, you can rebuild your temple, you're free. And the only named individual in the Old Testament who is ever labeled a Mashiach, a Messiah, is Cyrus in Isaiah 45. Cyrus is the Messiah of Israel because he lets the people go home. And so, 539 BC, the exile officially comes to an end, and these two tribes start returning, and then the rest of the book is kind of what they make of it. And again, in these last 11 chapters, there's a sense of great joy and expectation, but also a sense of great disillusionment and confusion as well. Because while their political circumstances have improved, their spiritual circumstances before God and with each other seem largely unchanged. The people are still unfaithful, they're not observing the law, they're still being dominated by their enemies, the nations are not bringing their wealth and their tribute to Zion, and so God's promises don't seem all that fulfilled. Last thing I'll mention now, this is one of the more confusing parts of reading the Old Testament in my experience. Even keeping track of the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, which one is the 10 tribes, which one is the 2 tribes, it's often easy to get lost there. The other thing that's often super confusing is the northern kingdom is called a lot of names by different prophets. And so in Isaiah, Ephraim is the preferred name for the northern kingdom. So whenever you read about Ephraim, this is not a Gentile nation, but it's not the good guys in Israel either. And so Ephraim, also every once in a while called Israel, is the northern kingdom. Judah is the southern kingdom. These guys go into exile in 701 BC. These guys in 587 BC. These guys come home 70 years later. These guys never come home. Questions, thoughts? If you can grasp this, and I've been a Christian for a long time, I went to seminary, I'm in ministry, I still get fuzzy with these details every once in a while. I'll be reading one of the prophets and I'm like, wait, which one is this? And when in history is this? If you can just grasp some of these basic dates and basic distinctions, it will really, really help you read the Old Testament better in the future, and especially Isaiah this summer. All right, let's move to authorship. And some of you might be profoundly bored by this, and it might seem irrelevant. Some of you might be bothered by this, but I want to give a couple of reasons why I think the modern consensus is right, that Isaiah, while the main figure, humanly speaking, in the book called Isaiah, should not be understood as the sole or probably even main author of the book. So let me lay these out, and I just encourage you as you read Isaiah this summer, think about these. The first is this: the book of Isaiah never claims that Isaiah writes any of it. There is no claim that Isaiah is the author. Just as when you're reading Amos, you never get the sense that Amos is the one actually writing this down. Prophets get words from the Lord to speak. They're not usually the scribes writing it down. It's usually someone else later on, whether a disciple of that prophet, or people reapplying that prophet's words and prophecies to later situations. But within the book of Isaiah, there's never a claim that Isaiah wrote any of it, let alone all of it. And This is why Hugh Williamson, who's a really famous Old Testament scholar, he specializes in Isaiah, he likes to call Isaiah the book called Isaiah. The book of Isaiah as a whole is associated with the figure of Isaiah, but that doesn't mean that Isaiah is the author of all of it, and I would say probably not even most of it. I do think Isaiah is behind all of this. Maybe some of it he actually wrote down, but even this, most of it I think is written by somebody else, and the rest of the book he's not directly involved in. Here's another one. Notice that sometimes when Isaiah shows up as a figure in the actual story, which isn't often, sometimes Isaiah speaks like I, me. In other times Isaiah is described in the third person. Isaiah said this, and then he went and did that. And just so you know, that's not usually how people speak about themselves. People usually speak about themselves in the first person. When third person shows up, it's usually because somebody else is writing. And so the switch from first to third person, I think, is more evidence that Isaiah is not the sole author of this book. Okay, very significant one. Isaiah disappears from 2nd and 3rd Isaiah and is never mentioned in these chapters. He is never mentioned and plays no role in these chapters, which I think is very, very significant. Now, the only possible exception to this argument is there are some people, and later on this summer I'm going to argue against this, but there are some people who think that the mysterious servant of the Lord who shows up in 40 to 55 is Isaiah. I don't think that's right, but that's the only way you could see Isaiah playing any role here. And again, as we saw, these chapters take place, and this will be the next argument. Isaiah ministers in this period of time. Isaiah is probably at least middle-aged already when Uzziah dies. And he's got another 40 years to go before Ahaz and Hezekiah come around. The final scene that Isaiah shows up in, chapter 38 and 39, Hezekiah, and that's the last king that's mentioned in chapter 1 that Isaiah prophesied according to. Just so you know, right, like if Isaiah's probably already at least 30 or 40 right here, Isaiah's just not alive here. Right? Isaiah's just not alive here. Right? Isaiah has been buried for centuries when this stuff is going on. This can't be about Isaiah. Now, the reason that historically conservative Christians and sometimes Jews have nonetheless thought that Isaiah wrote the whole book is because chapters 40 to 55 and 56 to 66 have often been understood as predictive glimpses into the future. That, yeah, Isaiah wasn't around when these things happened, but he predicted what these would be. There are, I think, two main reasons that that's unlikely, if not certainly not true. The first is this. The implied point of view of these chapters when you read them, and notice this when you read them, these chapters are not describing themselves as this is what's going to happen one day. They are describing themselves as this is what's going on right now. When prophets look into the future, they always say, it shall come to pass in the latter days that. These chapters are like, yeah, this is going on right now, and yeah, this is going on right now, and man, remember yesterday when that happened? Like, these chapters describe themselves as being in the present, not as predictions about the future. The implied point of view of both of these sections is they are describing what's happening in the present, not predictions of the future. I think that's an overwhelming argument against the idea that Isaiah, 3 centuries beforehand, looked into the future and was like, here's what the future holds. Okay, the second reason, and this is one that makes conservative Christians nervous, but I actually think it's a good argument, is the nature of prophecy itself. Turn to Isaiah 45. We'll just do this real quick. Now, there are bad reasons to argue against the sole authorship of Isaiah, like people can't tell the future in general. Prophets don't actually have supernatural insight into what's coming. Those are bad reasons, because God does exist and prophets can predict the future. But nonetheless, it's still worth pointing out that the way prophecy seems to work in biblical history and in even the present day through the Spirit is different than the way Isaiah works. So for instance, in Isaiah 45, if you look at the very beginning of it, if you think Isaiah wrote Isaiah 45, what you are saying is verse 1. Isaiah speaking, apparently writing, thus says Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, What you have there is Isaiah naming someone who's not going to be born for 200 years. Now, you might be like, yeah, because that's prophecy. Prophets see the future. Prophets don't see the future like that. Prophets, when they describe the future, and everybody agrees, whether it came true or not, whether it's genuine or not, this is a passage like Isaiah 2, which Teal will walk you through next week, where in the latter days, Zion will be the mountain, the city set on a mountain, and the nations will stream to it. When prophets look to the future, they traffic in generalities. They traffic in impressions. They traffic in images. They don't traffic in, 300 years from now, there's going to be a guy named Bob Jones, and he's going to go to 7-Eleven, and he's going to buy a Slurpee. Right? Like, that's not how prophets work. And if you don't believe me, just notice this in the future how prophets work, and I'll give you one example in the New Testament. The one place where Jesus unambiguously prophesies in the future is these three parallel passages, which are often known as the Olivet Discourse. Mark 13, the earliest one, Matthew 24, which I think is the next one, and then the latest version, Luke 21. And this is Jesus about 40 years before Jerusalem, like in Isaiah, is destroyed by the Roman Empire. And the people of Israel are conquered, and the temple is destroyed again. And Jesus predicts that this is happening. Now, if you read Mark 13 and Matthew 24, what you will read is very impressionistic, vague imagery of when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it shouldn't, run and let the reader understand what that means. And it's all just ripping off imagery that Daniel used anyway, centuries beforehand. Now, Mark is probably written before Rome even destroys Jerusalem in 70 AD. Matthew either right before it or right after it. And Matthew mostly just reproduces the vague prophetic imagery of here. When you read Luke 21, read it back to back with you sometimes. Whereas here, Jesus looks at the disciples and says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought to be, flee. You read Luke 21, what does Jesus say? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by Roman armies, run. Right? Like, Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said, when you see the kind of terrible stuff that Daniel was talking about in the first exile happening again, which does locate it with Jerusalem and the temple and pagan armies, but doesn't have specificity to it, Luke afterwards clarifies the original prophecy by making it very specific. That doesn't mean that Jesus didn't prophesy that that would happen. It means that the form that prophecy arrives in when it first comes is usually more in the form of general patterns, in general ideas of judgment and salvation, nations in Israel, Yahweh acting in judgment or mercy, and therefore needing to repent or continue to be disobedient. I think the fact that Cyrus is named in these chapters, I think that this is easy to miss, but there's just super specific cultural and historical details in these chapters that prophecy is never interested in predicting ahead of time. Like the names of places that aren't even named that when Isaiah is alive. The names of food and cultural practices that aren't even around 2 centuries before. These chapters talk and name those things specifically. I think the best explanation is someone took prophecies that Isaiah originally spoke that were more general and saw, you know what Isaiah was really talking about? Cyrus. You know what Isaiah was really talking about? Babylon. Even though Babylon was basically about as significant as Luxembourg during Isaiah's own lifetime. Assyria is significant during Isaiah's own lifetime. Babylon is not. Yeah, Micah.
I guess this gets back to the being someone else's mail thing. If this section of Isaiah 2 is going to have any impact when it was spoken or written, there's no way to be talking about Babylon that way.
No.
And if it's not relevant,
Yeah.
Saying
Absolutely.
Isaiah was speaking of relevancies.
Yes. And to go to something that Corinne mentioned earlier, which is super helpful, when we read predictions of judgment or salvation or whatever, is this about Jesus directly? Is this about us directly? And overwhelmingly, no. But prophecy is multivalent in the Old Testament. It's often originally about one thing, but when that thing finally comes to pass, just like the ultimate example is these chapters, there's often a sense of, no, there's got to be more to it than that. No, there's got to be more to it than that. And prophecies get reapplied to similar but different circumstances later on, which is why Jesus can say, guys, like within a generation, somebody's coming to kick the crap out of Jerusalem for rejecting the Messiah, but he doesn't name who it is, and instead he repackages language from Daniel, which maybe some of you know this, maybe not. According to Judaism, when Daniel talks about the abomination of desolation that leads to sacrilege, what does Judaism understand the fulfillment of that to be? And I'll give you a hint, it's not the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Judaism understands that to be about the Maccabean revolt a couple of centuries later, which I think it actually is in Daniel's own framework. Jesus isn't saying, no, it actually wasn't about when a Roman king or Caesar or general came, and what he did in the Maccabean revolt is went into the temple and sacrificed a pig in the Holy of Holies, the ultimate unclean animal. That's the abomination of desolation that Daniel's predicting. Jesus isn't saying, no, it wasn't that, it's this instead. Jesus is repackaging it and reapplying it to a similar but distinct situation. And so here's some language that's helpful to distinguish in the future. I'm going to argue that just about everything in Isaiah fits this. When you ask the question, how do we finally get to Jesus? And we will absolutely get to Jesus this summer. But when you ask, how do you get from Isaiah to Jesus? One very popular answer, and it's popular because it's very simple, is, well, Isaiah just predicted. Isaiah, 53, somebody's going to come and bear our transgressions and we're going to be healed by his wounds. Isaiah was just like, yeah, Jesus is coming someday. Which I actually think is almost never true. I don't think Isaiah 53 is about Jesus in this sense, as we'll see. Another way is to understand prophetic language as typological. And you can hear it, type. That prophetic language sets forth patterns that are typical of how God acts in the world. And I'll give you one really big reason I think almost all prophetic language is about this. Not only that it honors that Isaiah and other people in this book are speaking about their own historical circumstances, not a Messiah who's coming half a millennium later, but it also makes sense if Jesus is described as the suffering servant of Isaiah 40 to 55 in the New Testament, and he absolutely is. You know who else is described as the suffering servant of the Lord in the New Testament? You guys. The church. Can't be both if it's a prediction. But it can be if it's a pattern that happens over and over and over again in history as God sovereignly rules over history. And so again, even when you get to Jesus, let's put it this way, you get to Jesus by going through Israel first. Don't ever skip Israel. You always get to Jesus through Israel. These things are about what's happening to Israel, and therefore they're about Jesus, and therefore they're about us, the true Israel. Okay, questions, thoughts about that?
So what do we know about the actual man Isaiah?
Yeah, very little. Very little. Even, which is surprising because the book is so famous, it's so big, it's so long, but even compared to many of the other prophets who we rarely know much about, we know very little. Like Amos, we're told he was a shepherd. At least we know he was a shepherd. We're told almost nothing about Isaiah. The most common hypotheses are that Isaiah is a man of the city. Isaiah is the most urban of the prophetic books. So he's someone who seems to be a city dweller his whole life. Many of the other prophets are rural in their backgrounds and they come to the city. Isaiah seems to be an urbanite, and so he's a city man. The second thing is that he seems to have easy, direct, and maybe let's put it this way, uncontroversial access to kings. Prophets always speak against kings, but they usually get their heads chopped off early on because kings don't want to hear it. Isaiah seems to be buddy-buddy with both Ahaz and Hezekiah. He has no trouble getting direct audiences. So many scholars think that Isaiah was, apart from, in addition to his prophetic role, a political advisor to the kings in Jerusalem. But all of that is speculation. Isaiah, the book itself, tells us literally nothing about Isaiah, except that he prophesied during this period of time. Okay. Let's end with this real quick, and then we'll spend our last few minutes talking about themes. What difference does it make whether Isaiah wrote all of this, or whether he wrote none of it, or whether he wrote some of it, and somebody else wrote some of the other stuff? And I think here's the big one for me that helps. When you understand, let's go over here. When you understand that Isaiah stands historically behind all of this, 1 through 39, and maybe as author behind some of it or all of it, but doesn't stand as author in any direct sense behind 40 to 55 and 56 to 66, here's something that happens. What would be an example of this in modern literature? Let's see if I can think of something in a second. It's this. If there are distinct authors here, it means, and here's something that's uncontroversial today, when the multiple authorship of Isaiah theory first showed up 2.5 centuries ago, the way it first showed up was this. Somebody wrote this, and this was just a book by itself. And then somebody wrote this, and this is about something entirely else. And then somebody wrote this much later on, it's about something else. And for some random reason, somebody stapled these three things together, but they never were meant to be together. Almost everyone today, even the most liberal scholars, agree, while this is written much later than this shows unbelievable self-awareness of what is said in these chapters. And picks up themes and vocabulary and images and takes them in new directions, sometimes in ways that have tension. And these chapters are not only aware of these, but aware of these, that there's a momentum that builds throughout Isaiah. It would be, this is probably a bad analogy, but it would be like if we knew that the 3 books in the Lord of the Rings were actually written by 3 different authors who lived in 3 different lifetimes and they didn't overlap with each other, but we knew that whoever wrote Two Towers had read Fellowship of the Ring and was telling the story in light of that, but also to say new things to a new generation with new problems. And whoever wrote Return of the King knew both of them, but was also saying similar things because he agreed with the first 2 authors and their takes on things, but wanted to say the same kind of things to a different situation. There would be like a momentum that builds. And when we read Isaiah, we should have our eyes on the whole historical circumstance and hear this as a word that originally came to Isaiah about this, but then somebody in Israel or somebody's said what Isaiah said here has unbelievable relevance for here and has unbelievable relevance for here. And the reason all of this coming together is all of it is ultimately about what's still to come in the future. And what God said through Isaiah here is just the main thing that needs to continue to be heard by every generation in the future. I think you'll hear and read Isaiah as multi-layered and staggered in a way that you won't read this, use an image, you won't read Isaiah flatly. You'll read Isaiah as, here's what God said through Isaiah during his lifetime. Century and a half later, here's the implications of what Isaiah said to a later situation. And then finally, here's the ultimate implications here. And even then, given what Isaiah said here, given how his school of followers or whoever reapplied here, this can't be the end of the story, and therefore it looks into the future. It builds momentum when you see the interconnections between the book. I think it actually makes you a more refined, subtle, and attentive to details author of Isaiah if you understand multiple levels to be going on as you read. Okay, questions or thoughts about that for now? So just try it out. Try it out as you read. Okay, let's end in the next couple of minutes. If you need to take off, you can. I'm going to try to do this briefly as I can, because this is big. And honestly, even though we're doing it towards the end, I do think that what I'm about to do now is the most important thing we're doing tonight, and will be the most important thing for the rest of the summer. I've already hinted at it. I think the main theme of all 3 sections of Isaiah is the destiny of Zion. Turn to chapter 2. Teal's going to open with this next week. I don't want to steal her thunder, but let's look at it.
As if you could.
Sure. Sure. Isaiah 2. Although one of the things that I always think about when I think about Teal McGarvey, and I think about many things, but she preached or taught, was it at pre-retreat this year?
Yeah.
At the very beginning of the year, although it wasn't this one, in Isaiah 2, and this is one of the things that's always interesting, Isaiah 2 is almost exactly parallel to Micah 4. And Teal just preached an amazing message on Micah 4 at pre-retreat. And as you look at Isaiah 2, and you look at Micah 4 later, I want you to notice something right away. If you have ever read the Old Testament on a regular basis, I am sure that you have noticed that this is just a word, Zion. And I'm guessing you're like, well, like, isn't that a place in like the Matrix movies? Isn't that like where they all hide out? It's like, yeah, it is. Remember the name of their boat in the Matrix movies? Nebuchadnezzar. Like, there's all this weird prophetic imagery in the Matrix movies. And we're like, I don't know what Zion is. If you read the Old Testament sensitively, maybe you get some sense of this is kind of like Jerusalem, but not. It's kind of like what Jerusalem should be, but what Jerusalem isn't, which I think is right. But the unbelievable obsession with Zion in the Old Testament seems so foreign to us. But more than anything else, there's often a sense of what the heck does this have to do with being a Christian 2,000 years later? What role should Zion play in my Christian faith? And I want you to notice that in chapter 2, which I think is the actual beginning of 1st Isaiah. All of chapter 1 is an introduction to the next 3 Isaiahs overall, which means this is the first thing the book of Isaiah actually says. And the book of Isaiah doesn't start with the present. It gives us a glimpse of the ultimate future. It shall come to pass, chapter 2, verse 1. It shall come to pass, verse 2, in the latter days, and notice this kind of futuristic language that shows up everywhere in Isaiah, in that day, in the days to come, in the latter days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be lifted up above the hills, and the nations shall flow to it. There will be, verse 5, light that comes out of it. The nations and their kings will come to it and learn the ways of the Lord. Now, Zion, because it's another word for Jerusalem, is what kind of a place? Zion is obviously a...
Holy place, a high up place,
Okay, but like just like Boston and Cambridge and New York,
a real place.
it's a city, right? Whatever else Zion is, it's a city, and yet it is, according to chapter 2, a city that literally in the present day is, but in the future will be set on a mountain. When Jesus gets up at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and before he gives a single command, says, guys, you know who you are? You're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. You are a city set on a mountain. He's saying, you know who you guys are? You're Zion. That's who you are. You're Zion. If the destiny of Zion is the main theme of Isaiah, then we are what Isaiah is about. Because we are Zion. The New Testament